to kick off this exciting virtual conference, we have a special keynote address being delivered from all the way from London by Dr. Andy Palmer. He needs no introduction. Professional with over 40 years of experience in the automotive industry, more popular as the man responsible for launching Nissan Leaf, the world's first volume electric vehicle, and late the largest selling EV globally. So Dr. Andrew Palmer was also the CEO of Aston Martin, and now he wears multiple hats. In fact, among them being the chairman of Autocar PLC, the vice chairman of Switch Mobility, and also the vice chairman of Auto, a battery maker based in Slovakia. So without further ado, let me go across to Dr. Andrew Palmer, fondly known and popular as Andy. So Andy, thank you very much. Indeed, I would like to express our sincere gratitude for being up so early on a Monday morning to share your keynote address. We look forward to hearing a very, very interesting and insightful address from you. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and good morning. Yes, it's a little early in the morning, but it's a good way to start the week, and it's a great honor to speak with you today on a subject that you know is very close to my heart, which is the move towards EV. The global auto industry in general is an industry fundamentally challenged even prior to COVID-19. In a period of massive change, primarily driven by external factors forcing that change. Change is being driven by many influences. It's hard to put them in any order, but I would suggest perhaps the most profound is changing customer expectations. The most obvious is the emerging Gen Z consumer who view cars more like appliances. Nearly 56% agree a car represents essentially no more than a means of transport. Some 70% of Gen Z customers do not yet have their driving license, and up to 30% have no intention or desire to get one. In fact, Gen Z survey respondents actually ranked alternative reality, VR, and smart homes higher in their interest than vehicles, even autonomous vehicles. However, the good news, those who make up Gen Z do see autonomous vehicles as an eventual reality. Some 60% believe that they will use autonomous vehicles by 2029. The implications of these insights are far-reaching. The industry needs to immediately rethink how to excite Gen Z consumers and those that follow about the various transportation options. Automakers should complement or replace attributes of car coolness, such as horsepower, towing capacity, and even fuel economy, with new features such as productivity, shared time, or total experience. Gen Z has shown an early willingness to invest money and loyalty in brands that demonstrate an ability to align marketing with those new values synonymous with mobility culture. Take Madrid, with more than 5,000 electric scooters available for on-demand use as a means of cutting down on traffic, noise, pollution, and parking issues. Young Spaniards have flocked to these options, with companies increasing the size of the fleet more than 5-fold in the past 12 months. As I said, the changing customer dynamics is but one of the challenges facing the auto industry. Technology, environmental considerations, and legislation are all imposing change. Those Gen Z vehicle owners lead the charge towards electric vehicles more than any other generation. Combine that growing demand with growing legislation and the technology push of new entrants, and you have the most significant disruptive influence on the auto industry since the horse gave way to the car. The auto industry is going zero emissions, and by zero emissions, what I'm really saying is we're going EV. The speed of the change was partially self-inflicted with the Dieselgate scandal, but the move to both clean up inner city air and reduce human impact on the environment is an inevitable route of travel. The route to EV is more disruptive on the industry than any other events in history, since it opens the closed shop to newcomers. The technology is far simpler than the internal combustion engine, and the EV allows easier entry for the digital disruption led by the tech companies. Ironically, despite the substantial overcapacity and excess numbers of brands, the barrier to entry are lower than ever, hence the rise in the startup EV makers in China and in the United States. So we go into a decade of change. Legislators reflecting the demands of a changing generation that require clean transportation. Customers with new values and demanding changes in the way that we travel. Technology that is disruptive, and a startup culture that is capable of wobbling the establishment. The auto industry will describe these trends in their normal four-letter acronyms, in this case, CASE: connected, autonomous, shared, and emission-free. This is superficially how the industry deals with the so-called threat, but in reality, the investment in transforming the portfolio to EV is enormous and will have a material impact on each car maker's bottom line over the coming years. Some manufacturers, for example, have guided us to expect a 30% reduction in EBIT to pay for the investments. The reality might be even greater. And the changes started to gain real momentum. In 2019, the number of light electric vehicles reached 2.26 million units, 9% higher than in 2018. Global sales of electric cars accelerated faster in 2020, rising by 43% to more than 3 million, despite overall car sales slumping by a fifth during the corona pandemic. Turning to public transport, forecasts indicate that approximately 40% of new city buses registered in Europe by 2025 will be EV. Currently, Netherlands has been the quickest to adopt electric buses in Europe, and globally, China is far ahead. The Clean Vehicle Directive will be one of the biggest drivers for the adoption of zero-emission buses across Europe. The CVD states that public authorities should procure a minimum number of zero-emission vehicles, the exact percentage of which varies by country. Likewise, in India, the FAME 2 requirements give rise to a 7,000 bus demand by 2022. So the preliminary EV sales data is very positive, but we have still a long road ahead, and it will profoundly impact the industry. That road is predominantly EV. I predict that it will consume any trend towards PHEV in the relatively near term, for duplicating technologies on one car simply doesn't make sense. Battery technology will evolve quickly through derivatives of lithium ion and eventually to solid state by 2030. Compared to where I personally started when developing the Nissan Leaf, the journey to affordable and usable battery electric vehicle is within sight. The way forward for fuel cell is less clear. It's always a technology that is right 10 years from now. I do, however, see a case for fuel cells in trucks and heavier vehicles as we sit here today. But we should acknowledge that battery technology is progressing along the Moore's curve and continues to make the business case for fuel cell investment harder and harder. Moreover, I find myself increasingly drawn to e-fuels or synthetic fuels, fuels which are carbon neutral but allow manufacturers potentially to use their existing internal combustion assets. This development, I'm sure, will be led by the aero industry, where there is virtually no alternative on their journey to zero emissions. But I predict that we may see this technology piloted in future Formula One cars, and I see it as a viable option for supercars, for example. Whether fuel cells or synthetic, hydrogen will play some part in the future, although I would point to its initial usage in industry rather than transport. My point is that while we must be single-minded in the journey to zero emissions, we must not be myopic. There can be almost no one in this industry more bought into EV technology than I. I champion this technology in the development of the Leaf. However, while I expect the majority of the 2030 sales to be EV, I still believe that we should not legislate EV. Rather, we allow a Darwinistic approach to the technologies of zero emission and enjoy the best of breed in each of the segments. But we cannot be idle, and there are some forms of transport where tomorrow needs to happen today, as the technology is already ready. Expect buses to go 100% EV in the very near future, especially those in cities. It's that challenge that tempted me to Optare and Ashok Leyland, and the drive to establish a unique bus and van company dedicated to EV deployment worldwide. It's called Switch Mobility Limited. I wish to lead this change in the democratization of clean transportation, and I'm excited that it will be hand in glove with Switch's Indian owners, Ashok Leyland and the Hinduja Group. I'm betting my future on EVs and on India. My belief is that India can and will step up to the challenge, that it will take its place domestically and globally on the EV stage. Switch will source the majority of its components from India, but like all nascent concepts, it needs a healthy domestic market to succeed. So here's a wake-up call for the Indian industry. The world is fast moving to EV buses and EV pods. Chinese manufacturers have a huge home market advantage and are already at scale. I hope India, and indeed the rest of the world, will legislate for urgent adoption of EV buses in the very near term. Buses, delivery vehicles and taxis are the prevalent source of pollutants in urban air and the easiest to fix. I would call upon governments to expedite the replacement of city fleets with modern EV buses. So, an industry in the flux of change, an industry that for the first time in 100 years is seeing new players. We will see turmoil, we will see bankruptcies, and we will see collaboration and consolidation. And that is why I love this industry. The question today is whether India will step up and take its place among the world leaders of EV. I hope through the next 2 days that you will conclude that India needs to. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, thank you very much, Andy, for that very, very insightful and encouraging, I would say, I'm sure, for the industry address. And indeed, and good to know that Switch is looking at sourcing a majority of its components and from India, thereby underlining the importance of India as a sourcing hub for the EV industry as well. And but if I may ask you, Andy, you have virtually seen the EV industry right from its birth in the modern automotive industry. While one can always argue that the original EV was older than the first combustion, but let's not go into history. In the modern era, you have seen the birth of the EV industry, and that's when Nissan started the Leaf. But do you think that the goalposts keep changing quite often for the industry in various markets? I've seen people, even in India, the inflection point was expected quite some time ago, but that never happened. So do you think there may be no more such shifts in the near future?
Look, I think we went through the main inflection point when let's say that EVs were no longer considered really marginalized. If you survey let's say European customers, what you'll find is I think something like 40 or 50% of them will tell you that an EV will be their next purchase. So I think what we've done is we've managed to change in the main the mind from, let's say, when I started on EVs 15 years ago. I mean, you may or may not remember, Sumantra, but when I first made that announcement that we as Nissan were going to start selling EVs, one famous industry commentator said that Nissan may as well take $4 billion and throw it in the ocean. So there was a lot of pushback then. I think nobody would call it madness anymore. I mean, it's norm. Now, what has changed, I think, is the understanding of the challenge. I mean, when I started, we were all about zero tailpipe and zero tailpipe emissions. There is no tailpipe. I think if I look at the industry now, we start to think about net zero emissions, which is we have to think about the carbon generated not only from the vehicle itself, but also from the manufacturing and indeed the end of life of the vehicle. And I think that's the new challenge, because, you know, talking about getting to net zero by 2040 or 2050, it's not fast enough. It's not fast enough for the planet. And I think we have to put in mind more like 2030 or 2035. And I think that's going to become the hot topic. And I know that we have a COP26 coming up it happens to be in Glasgow later this year. And I think that humanity needs to gather around that. And we as an industry have to play our part in that. And we have to be able to go and, under our own control, explain how we as an industry are going to get to net zero in let's say a reasonable time frame. Because if we don't, it's going to be legislated on us. And my problem with legislation, as I said in the speech, is frankly, politicians aren't qualified to mandate the solution. If they mandate the solution, they make mistakes like they did with diesel, where they mandated diesel and we all found out later that it creates particulate problems. And then there's an overreaction to that. We have to, as an industry, we have to, as a body, decide what types of technology we want to use. And in the end, it doesn't matter whether it's EV, fuel cell, in-cylinder combustion of hydrogen, or synthetics. I think we can let Darwinism play out there, but we can't sit idle. We can't stand and wait, because if we stand and wait, people less qualified than us will decide the future for us, and that's only bad for the industry.
And and talking about India, Andy, you said that yes, India can have its place in the global automotive industry, a respectable place at that. But towards that, in an age where there is in an age where it is getting increasingly competitive, increasingly challenging economically, would you recommend Indian industry to focus on certain segments, maybe two-wheelers, or maybe commercial vehicles, maybe three-wheelers, maybe passenger vehicles, and similarly for the supplier industry also, to kind of identify key core areas where they should focus on, not really exclusively, but focus strongly?
Well, India has a large domestic fleet. It's potentially the second largest populous consumer population in the world, and it needs to start exercising that. And it needs to start exercising that in a way which is supportive of India. So in that sense, not simply going out and buying Chinese technology. There's a lot of talent in India, and it needs to start using it. but it needs its politicians to get behind it and legislating in a way that allows that to happen. Yes, it's easier to start from a central point of view with things that you more easily control, and you more easily control things like big fleets. So it's relatively easy, for example, to legislate that you go 100% electric bus, because you've got control of those fleets. Likewise, you go to net zero trucks. I think that in the things like commercial vehicles, in vans, etc., that the logistics industry will decide by itself to go there, and I think that that will drive a move from three-wheelers to four-wheelers, electric three-wheelers to electric four-wheelers. But the passenger car area is a little bit more complicated, because each consumer is having to make those changes. But I do see very clearly the move to what one could call, I suppose, the affordable vehicle. And I think that the area where India is really good at bringing its innovation is probably around that area. The affordable EV doesn't really exist today. Even a Nissan Leaf, which was designed in that sense, is expensive compared to the affordability of most people in most of the world. So I think through bringing that, let's call it lean engineering, frugal mindset, whatever you want to call it, I think there's a breakthrough there, that if the good and the great in India, and there are a lot of them, if they could focus their attention on there's a place to be won in the world through that affordable passenger vehicle, on top of affordable vans and affordable buses.